All right, let's talk about Don Quixote and Sancho Panza. These beautiful pieces of art will disappear soon, but I think this is helpful for understanding some of the binaries that exist within this particular text. Look at Don Quixote. He is an old man on a horse. He is a minor noble. He is tall. He is skinny. He does not like to eat or sleep, and he has an imaginary lady love. Sancho is a different class from Don Quixote. He is a peasant rather than a minor nobleman. He is illiterate. He does not read. Something to keep in mind while reading this text is the most curious, interesting characters are those who can read. They're often also the characters that can play jokes and have good senses of humor. When we meet Inés de Pasamonte, for example, and we hear about his own autobiography, this will be interesting. And then, of course, Grysóstomo and Marcella. Grysóstomo is a great poet and is known for being learned, wearing the gown of a scholar. We don't really think of it as profound an achievement in the 21st century America to graduate from college, but at this time, in the 17th century, to have graduated from college meant that you was basically like getting a really high-level PhD. It meant that you were one of the few extremely learned people. You were literate, you knew poetry, you knew how to count, you could keep books. You had a skill set that seemed a lot like magic to everybody else. And I would say, as somebody who's highly literate, who works in multiple languages, that I still experience this when I talk to people. And I share like some Latin quote or some little bit of French. It doesn't impress all of you because you all know Laissez le bon temps rouler. Did any of you not know that? It's the Mardi Gras. That's the Mardi Gras anthem. It means, what does it mean? Let the good times roll. Exactly. So you have to know Laissez le bon temps rouler and be able to say that right, even if nothing else. But it seems letters and literature and moving and communicating by means of language seems like magic to those who do not understand it. And part of what we are parsing today is there does seem to be a real effect that language can have. Say if somebody swears at you, that will have an effect on you. If someone accuses you, or someone at the beginning of a race says, begin, or at the beginning of an exam. There are language acts that change things, or I declare this place open now, convocatum est, as we say at the beginning of a semester at fancy colleges. That means it has begun. Convocatum est. We are convened. We are called together, truly as well. Convocatum est means. In any case, Sancho is illiterate. He brings this up over and over again. And so this will lead to some interesting differences in perception between Don Quixote and Sancho, not only because Don Quixote is crazy, but also because Don Quixote sees the world differently due to his literacy, due to the fact that he can read and has read. And so Sancho has access not to anything that is written down, he can't read any of it, but rather just to folk wisdom in that which he has said. And something that will happen over and over again in part two, as you are now experiencing, is that Sancho will, over and over again, will give saying after saying after saying, proverb after proverb after proverb. Sort of like when speaking to somebody who does not have a lot of care for their language and speaks in platitude after platitude, or cliche after cliche, like, well, you know, one in the hand is better than two in the bush, and you know, out of sight, out of mind. Maybe they'll even contradict themselves, and they'll say, well, home is where the heart is, or let's see, out of sight, out of mind is one way of putting it. There's another opposing proverb that we have, which is, yes, absence makes the heart grow fonder. So you can't even trust your proverb, because which is it? In any case, also physically speaking, Sancho is short, Don Quixote is tall. Sancho is chubby, fat, he's described as. He has a paunch, panza, means belly, like having a gut. He likes to eat. Don Quixote does not like to eat. He likes to drink. Don Quixote does not like to drink. He likes to sleep. Don Quixote is cerebral, whereas Sancho is more physical. And then, of course, also Sancho is supposedly a squire, though he is himself a man of an age not so much lower than Don Quixote. Traditionally, squires would themselves become knights. They were usually young men. Also, and this is something Don Quixote has to check against his books, Sancho obviously rides on a donkey, not a horse. And so when looking at Sancho, excuse me, and particularly thinking about modernism, does he make the grade? Does he make the cut? Is he a squire? Being so old, being of a different rank from squire, squirely rank is generally even a higher rank than Don Quixote's natural rank. Because he is in fact not a knight, not a lord, not somebody, though he does have land, he is not landed. And that he does not rule the land that he owns, or excuse me, he does not rule the province in which the land exists that he owns. He owns his own sort of private bit of land. Though that said, the king could take his land if he wanted to. So note all of these major differences between these characters. And then what I want you to start thinking about as you read is there a bit of cross-pollination going between them? Does Sancho affect Don Quixote? Does Don Quixote affect Sancho? Is there something gritty, something from the lower class of Sancho, or something that the sort of joie de vivre, as we say, joy of life, in French, which is the right language to say this in, does that start to affect Don Quixote? On the other hand, does the literariness of Don Quixote start to affect Sancho? And then an even bigger question is, when they perceive the world different, knowing that Sancho is sane, though illiterate, and Don Quixote is literate, but insane, whose perception of things is correct? Particularly if we are thinking about the subjective and relative nature of perception in a modernist text. Who is to trust? And keep in mind, this is in fact a text. So these are not actual humans seeing things. These are representations of humans who have their own perceptions. So to say that the reality of the text is misperceived by either of these characters is kind of odd, because can we see the reality of the text except through the eyes of someone else, a narrator or the characters themselves? You're reading Harry Potter. Do you see Albus Dumbledore? Or do you only see him described by the narrator and the actions of the plot and the characters who see him? In fact, one of the first things you ever hear about him when you read the first Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, which was rebranded to America as Sorcerer's Stone because we're so uneducated that we would not know the true title's meaning, which is Harry Potter and any of you know this? The Philosopher's Stone, which is an ancient, really more of a medieval idea. The Philosopher's Stone is a creation that can do two things, two impossible things, and you might want to think about its relationship to Don Quixote. The Philosopher's Stone, which is what the medieval alchemists, who would later become the chemists, pursued, was an object that could turn crude matter, dross, low quality metal into gold. Perhaps it's a metaphor for education. That is the assumption of 20th, 21st century education. That education can do anything. Perhaps it can, insofar as anything can do anything. But it could also do one other key thing. This is what's important to Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, that we call Sorcerer's Stone, foolishly, is that it can make one immortal. You take a mortal thing, turn it from mortal to immortal. The great desire of all things doomed to die, somehow transcend their death. We see this over and over again. We see this in the production of children. We see this in the production of art. We see this in the pursuing of myths and religions throughout the world. I'm not suggesting that any of these are wrong pursuits, but that these are clearly pursuits in searching for immortality. All right, Don Quixote is an old, tall, minor nobleman who likes to read, really is obsessed by reading, lives according to a chivalric code from a time long past that actually did not exist. Like people, many Americans' ideas of the conventional 50s, where things were so normal, followed by the 60s, where things were so crazy. And who does not like to eat? He rides on a beaten down old nag named Rocinante. Something about language there. Rocinante with a C is the original sort of Spanish spelling, whereas Rocinante with an S is the more Americanized. Did any of you notice with the Spanish edition of Don Quixote that I passed around for seminar on Monday, the difference in spelling of Don Quixote's name? What was the difference? There was a J instead of an X. Did any of you take Spanish or know a little Spanish? Okay, help me out. If I write this on social media, what am I saying? Ha ha, I'm laughing, right? It's not like German. where this would mean what and be pronounced how? Yeah, and it means yes, right? So it's ha ha. So you say J's are weird. You know, J is the newest letter in the Latinic alphabet, that it was once I. We just got longer and longer and longer. That's why Jesus' name, for example, any of you gone to a Catholic Mass, Ignomine, Patria, Spiritus Sancti, you know how Jesus' name is said in Latin? Often, Jesu, Yay, yup. This, you know Kanye, yup, yay. He knows a little bit about this too. He's a poet, knows something about language. That's what he goes by these days. In any case, so you say the J makes a ha sound. So Quixote. The Spanish speakers seem to have gotten it right. Why this quixotic word, and that is of course a word based on this text, why do we, in our English translation, have an X in the middle? Any other places you know that have Spanish influence with an X in the middle of their name? Mexico, pretty close to us. There's one other pretty close to us too. Also spelled differently in Spanish. One of us here is from there. I don't know if that person's here today. Stay right next to here to the west. They were once a country of their own. Texas, my goodness. And if you ever hear a Spanish pronunciation of both Mexico and Texas, have you heard it? What is it? Tejas, Mexico. This is because the F's, prior to the ascension of the J, carried the weight of the H sound. So Mexico is a common modern way of saying Mexico. The X once made the H sound. It's part of the reason the X is sort of weird. For example, you all don't have a consistent way of saying X either. I'll give you this word. One of our major universities in Louisiana. How do you say that? How do you say that? Not a text.
What?
The word I just spelled.
Javier.
That's funny that you say Javier. Javier. Yeah, I guess with the Spanish, that would be a way of saying that. I like that. Javier like that. Okay, that's a third way. I wasn't even expecting that. How would you say this? Not with this current lesson. Xavier. Somebody else would say it yet differently. What's the other way that people like to say this now? Xavier, right, because the X doesn't have a standard sound. It has a Z sound and a cuss sound. So my own name, Alexander. But then people will shorten the name and go by Xander. And so you notice this, Y is also the same, right? Honest T makes a vowel sound at the end, but U makes a consonantal sound at the beginning. In any case, getting down into the weeds, as it were. But this too is something to keep in mind when you're thinking about the importance of language, how language changes, and why things are spelled in the ways that they are. Often there is a genealogy or an archaeology in this case that you can follow. All right, I really have to get on. Yes.
When Cervantes wrote it, did he put the X or
He did. So it is modern Spanish translation or modern Spanish editions that then change the name to the modern spelling. So the original name is with the X. So we in America maintain the original. And in fact, we still have this word quixotic, which is to suggest that somebody's a little bit weird. You might say about me, I'm a little quixotic. And we'll have words from other texts too, like Faustian bargain, for example. But we keep now, not only do we keep the original X, but then we change the original X's sound to our sound for X. So it's original and not original in the same way. So it is the official title and the more Spanish title. So if you ever read any Spanish language scholars on Don Quixote, or you see Quixote with a J, know that that is the Spanish sort of official. It's not wrong, but it's a different convention to then change the word to the modern spelling of the word. So good question. Okay, I'm going to go fairly quickly through several episodes of the first part of Don Quixote, but in so doing, I think I can go pretty quickly because we've talked about a lot of this from the get-go. So after Don Quixote dons his helmet, which is not really a knight's helmet, but he defines it as such, gets on his noble horse, which is not really a noble horse, but he calls Rosinante a noble horse and goes out on his adventures. He starts to witness what we often call in this sort of text episodes. This is where the term episodes for television shows comes from. And the idea of being episodic is that disconnected events that follow each other in a narrative come one after another. So an episodic show is one that doesn't tell like Netflix, a consistent narrative across 10 or 11 shows, but one that more like Friends, an older sort of situational comedy sitcom. There are standalone episodes. So something happens and it's its own little story. And then the next episode, something happens and it's its own standalone story. Or, South Park, or old cartoon, Family Guy, The Simpsons are like that. You can tell that these are made for sort of less sophisticated audiences because you don't have to maintain a consistent and elongated narrative in order to follow it. You can just jump right in. You might also see this as a convention of comedy rather than drama, because the longer you spend with characters, the more it hurts when they hurt. And the less you know about them, the easier it is to laugh at them, right? If I fall right now in front of you, you see me every now and then, you're like, I don't really care about this guy. Pretty funny, pretty funny. In any case, this noble knight goes out on his adventures. Were he an actual noble knight, and he were to come upon a master beating a servant named Andres, who we will see later, how would you expect this to go? Well, one is an armed knight of noble rank. One is this evil master beating his poor servant for what he claims are noble reasons. You might expect this to be resolved by, say, the knight commanding the master to stop beating his servant, and then to command the master to, if the servant claims that he is being beaten because he has asked for money that is back paid, that is due to him, that has not been paid to him for several months, you might then expect the knight to demand that payment to the servant and then all live happily ever after. But in fact, you will note with this modernist text and with Don Quixote's sort of strange bent, his madness, things do not go as he expects them to go. In the same way that things are not as they appear to him. And so a major problem with him getting the effect that he wishes to have is that he is not understanding the factors in any situation accurately. And this is something powerful for perhaps you to keep in mind. If things keep going wrong for you, are you seeing the situation correctly, or do you need to reformulate what it is you see? Do you need to recalibrate? Do you need to rethink your approach to something? In any case, do I have anything more here? Okay, good. Don Quixote attempts to right a wrong, but he muddles things up in a way that becomes characteristic. So what happens here? This master is beating the servant for losing sheep. This is a big deal. You can't lose sheep if you're a herds person. The servant claims he's owed back pay. Don Quixote then has the master promise to repay the servant. The master says menacingly, I'll certainly repay him. The idea being, well, is he going to repay him in money or in lashes on his back? Well, he claims money, but it's going to be lashes. In fact, we'll find out in part 2 that this poor servant, Andres, wishes he had never met Don Quixote or any sort of errant knight, because his master will, in fact, beat him to within an inch of his life. And so the master promises to do exactly what Don Quixote says right after Don Quixote leaves. And Don Quixote goes on thinking that he has righted a wrong, but in reality, he has earned even more lashes for this young man. And so this is characteristic of the adventures of Don Quixote, that he misreads the situation, interacts with the situation in a way often considered crazy, and then often leaves a catastrophe or chaos where once even some semblance of order reigned for him. All right, I'm going to skip the episode of the muleteer. This continually happens in the first 10 chapters or so. Chapter 6, we see at the behest of the niece and the housekeeper, as well as Master Nicholas, the barber, and the priest, a desire for those who know and love Don Quixote to get rid of the source of his madness. They think, and are obviously right from the first paragraph of the text, that the books in his library have driven him crazy and have taken a good, fairly noble man, turned him into a madcap, as it were. And so we go through a little bit of literary analysis. Only a couple of things I want to mention there to you is that, in fact, the barber and the priest are in charge of this endeavor. So keep in mind here, so that this is a representation to some extent of the taste of the common folk, of the barber, but also of the priest, of the ecclesiastical, or rather, this is a representation of the censorship of the church of imaginative literature. You might say that sounds sort of crazy, and I'd say we still censor literature with our we still have censoring bodies that censor literature, censor music, that censor video games, that censor movies. This is why we have rating systems, for example. Those are attempts at censoring. So even if those aren't done by people in religious garb, it is done by functionaries who do the same job. In any case, Amadis de Gaul is preserved. Remember that this is the great exemplar of Don Quixote, alongside Orlando and King Arthur, whom he gives us a short disposition on, and also Cervantes's La Galatea, because he is a dear friend of the author. Very much indicative of the fourth part of our definition of modernism from Maurice Bede, concerned with the construction of a narrative or literature itself. Apparently, the writer of this story that is being narrated to us by a narrator who himself has a translated edition of a true history from a Moor named Cid Hameti Benengeli, apparently the author of the entire thing lives within the context of the text itself. That would be like me writing a book and having a character, Mr. Schmidt, exist within the world that I have created. This is something that sometimes directors or creators do. And any of you Marvel movie fans, don't have to admit it, but Stan Lee, the creator of Marvel, I believe he's the creator of Marvel, he finds his way into many of those movies in very small parts, yes.
And so is this meant to actually be Cervantes in the book, or just a guy named?
This is the actual book by Cervantes that exists in the library of Don Quixote. So Don Quixote, the creation of Cervantes, ostensibly is also a reader of Cervantes. This is very reminiscent of of a lot of M.C. Escher's art. Perhaps you've seen it, the white birds and the black birds that are flying into each other and become each other, or the water, it looks like it's going down and up at the same time, but even more famously, and I think I have an image of this somewhere, the hands drawing each other. And so what makes you an artist? Having art inside of you, or making art? It's sort of a banana question, chicken and egg question, but we might be. Does one become something by doing it? Or does one become something by identifying something? These are questions. But in any case, this is part of the mind-bending bit. If Cervantes's book exists in a book that he wrote, then he must be the author of the book. He must exist within the text somewhere or another. And yet he is obviously the author of this text and does not exist in there objectively at all. But this is part of the masterful nature of Cervantes. Many of the other books are destroyed, and even several of them are cast to the flames, just because the priest and the barber get tired of doing the cataloging and get sick of it, and then just cast all the other books into the flames, which is an interesting take on censorship. That they're basically using their heads until they just say, everything else can go. All right. When Don Quixote, probably the most famous episode of the first part of Don Quixote, and one that is even represented in popular adaptations of Don Quixote, like the Wishbone adaptation, where a young dog represents him, is the episode of the windmills. And if you look at that representation, it's pretty good. It shows not only what Sancho sees, but also what Don Quixote sees. Sancho sees, in a realist sort of way, windmills. Don Quixote sees giants, and in a reappropriation of the myth, he says, even if that giant has more arms than Briareus, is one of the hecatoncheires of Greek mythology, one of the 100-handed giant, hekatos, 100, kairos, like chiropractor, and was such a powerful giant. Perhaps you've never heard of him. He's mentioned in the first book of the Iliad by Homer. Was such a powerful giant that when Zeus, the king of the gods, was once bound, it was Briareus and his two brothers, named respectively for thunder and lightning, Brontes and Steropes, Brontosaurus, for example, thunder lizard, that freed Zeus. So Don Quixote says, even if this giant is more powerful than the most powerful conceivable giant, I will defeat it. That said, he gets picked up by one of the I suppose I'll say flaps, parts of the windmill with his horse and dropped down on his back in his armor, which causes severe injury to him and to his horse. This is something that happens over and over to Rocinante, over and over to Don Quixote, and over to Sancho. And in fact, there are two key moments that I hope to get to today where we see pain inflicted on both Sancho and Don Quixote, and in fact, see something that we do not often see in a protagonist, which is disfigurement. He is going to become, not only is Don Quixote old, but he will soon be disfigured and old when he loses a part of his ear. And will take on yet a new name after that. Any of you know which name he takes on, which Sancho gives him?
The Knight of the Sorrowful Face.
The Knight of the Sorrowful Face, yes. And that is later replaced by Knight of the Lions when he defeats a lion in combat. Scarecrows, feats. All right, good. Don Quixote sees giants in the distance. He attacks them. As he attacks, the wind moves the fan. That's what we call these fan blades of the windmill. And he's picked up and dropped in a heap. Another loss for Don Quixote. Will he ever win? Chapter 9. He has an episode with a Basque of his time. Something that needs to be made clear, at least about Spain, is that Spain is a place with many ethnic and linguistic groups and a very rich history. Spain is not just a Catholic place. Spain, south of Spain, for example, is very famous for having robust Jewish and Muslim populations, and even Spain itself is known for having a distinct language present in it that, as far as we know, shares no linguistic similarities with any other languages. And that is the Basque. There's a region called the Basque region. They have a language called Basque, and Biscayans cannot understand Spanish speakers, and Spanish speakers cannot understand them. So in your translation, when it looked like he was illiterate, when the Basque could not speak good Spanish, which in translation is good English, the reason is that he is a native speaker of a different language, and that is coming through his linguistic and ethnic difference there. So something to know about Spain is it's an extremely diverse place, not nearly as diverse as the United States, nowhere in the world is or ever has been, but it is not a univocal, not just a it is an integral whole. This goes to show you something about the geographic borders that make an ethnos, that make a nation, and the sorts of peoples who speak languages and come from different lineages that will be part of a whole. So that which is one is often many. We emphasize this through having 50 states and one nation, and we put this on our money. E pluribus unum. Unum, one. E pluribus, from many. One from many. So that's supposed to be what? Many people make a people, many states make a country, something like that. And so many different sorts of things make a unity in this case. All right. During the combat with this Basque, who becomes upset with Don Quixote, because he is describing to these various goat herds and muleteers the beauty of his lady Dulcinea, and he is holding them up and refuses to let them go. This Basque picks up a pillow to use as a shield and then attacks Don Quixote. And attacking Don Quixote and his terrible helmet that is useless, he cuts off a part of his ear. Ow. Hurt. Don Quixote then strikes the Basque on the head, knocks him out. The first win for Don Quixote, and though at a terrible price. Now that he is now that he has hurt his ear, he thinks, if only I had this Balm of Fierabras, it would basically make me invincible and totally heal me, even if I had been cut in half. Monty Python fans will probably enjoy that. 'Tis but a flesh wound, if you know that. This is obviously coming from this. in any case, the goat herds think, oh, well, that's pretty good, but we're going to give you some salt and rosemary, put it on this leaf, put it on your ear. They give a folk remedy, not from books, and it actually does the trick. It actually makes Don Quixote's ear feel a little bit better, whereas his Balm of Fierabras that he learned about from what? A work of fiction is probably going to have, well, do you think a positive effect on his health or a negative effect? You know, if you're playing Final Fantasy 16 and you're reading how to summon an Aeon, and it gives you some words to say, and you say those words out loud, do you think that you will summon some godlike being like Bahamut or Afreet? Or would, if you were doing this publicly, would people probably think you were crazy? It's kind of funny because we do things where we say sort of absurd things out in public and people don't think we're crazy, right? We even go to certain places where we can do that. And you're allowed to go to places that say this or you say that. I'm talking about, of course, the incantations that you say in various places of worship, for example, right? You are very much allowed to say things like, you know, my wings will take me up. And people will be like, that's totally cool. That's true. Whereas if you were to say that in the middle of a plot, you probably think, I don't know about this person. So saying the right things in the right places, there is some connection. Remember when we talked about events, time and place. These things do exist, whether we know them or not, and whether we change them. In any case, we now know that this Balm of Fierabras exists. We can expect that it's not going to be very helpful in our time of need. All right, there's a nice representation of Don Quixote fighting, Sancho saying, don't fight, and Don Quixote eventually winning. Is the pillow of the Basque there? You can see his pillow shield right here. It's a very absurd, farcical sort of fight, like what was it, Jake Paul versus Mike Tyson. All right. The narrative then breaks off to suggest that this narrator ran out of the first volume of Sid Hameti Benengeli's very true history and accurate history of Don Quixote. Something else I wanted to say to you about that. Over and over again, it is iterated and reiterated by this narrator that the history written by Sid Hameti Benengeli of the lying Moorish race is very much true. Not only does this seem like a bit of hypocrisy in that he takes Sid Hameti at his word, though he considers the race from which he comes from a lying race, but also, what else is missing for him to be able to confirm that this is true? Here's the question. How does the narrator know what he's reading is the truth? How can he possibly confirm it? He seems to just be granting. Just to give you a little bit of context about this, I'll give you a syllogism so that you understand a little bit of the paradox that is present here. All Cretans, we might say, or we know that Don Quixote would say, Moors are liars. This is the major premise. I am a Cretan. Is the minor premise. What follows from this? I am, therefore, a liar. Now here's the mix. Am I lying or telling the truth when I say that? All Cretans are liars. I am a Cretan. Therefore, I am a liar. But am I telling you the truth when I tell you that I'm a liar? Or am I lying to you as you know that I do? And so as you might say that all liars don't lie about all things, and that's part of the difficulty. Liars themselves are creators of fictions, like so many of the characters within this text. What is the similarity? What is the difference between being an author, creator of art, and a liar? A misstater of the truth, often intentionally. In any case, as I've said before, the narrator picks up various scraps of paper, hands them to a man who understands Arabic. He starts to laugh. He mentions characters from Don Quixote. So the narrator then takes the papers that he purchases the papers from this bazaar. He then has a young boy translate them, and then we get back to the text. And so very strange. This is why the narrator himself says he is not father to this text, but his stepfather to it, which I think is somewhat appropriate there. All right. We've said all this. We've said all this. All right. Chapter 12, we get to the story of Grysóstomo and Marcella. Another name that has a slightly different Spanish spelling from, say, well, I'll say the original Latin. I guess this is actually Greek. Grysostomos is the original name, but the Spanish version of it is Grysóstomo, going from the US ending of the OS ending of Greek to the vowel ending of Spanish, O, and replacing the C with a G. In any case, there's a character, a well-to-do young man who falls in love with a well-to-do young lady named Marcella. Marcella has herself experienced great tragedy. Both of her parents have died, but they've left her extremely well endowed. Apparently, also, she's extraordinarily beautiful. And so she, like Helen of Troy, becomes the object, the apple of many of the local men's eyes. One day, however, she has an uncle. He sort of like the Sultan from Aladdin, but sort of not like him, wants her to get married, but he will not force any marriage upon her. So she has choice in a way that some characters at this time and in the story do not have. And she has decided that she wants to live a life of abstinence. She might fall in love at some point, but she's going to wait to fall in love. And so all of these suitors that come to see her, she turns away, including this Grysóstomo. In fact, she becomes so tired of the life of the city and the pursuit of the city boys that she dons the clothes of a shepherdess, very much like As You Like It in the Shakespearean comedy, and leaves the confines of the city and goes out into the woods to be a shepherdess. Grysóstomo follows her. He is known for being quite the scholar. He's a bachelor not in terms of being single, but a bachelor of the arts, like you become when you graduate, or bachelor of whatever it is, BA, BS, Bachelor of Science, Bachelor of Business Administration. You become bachelors too. Perhaps eligible. In any case, he becomes so smitten by this woman that he has some idea of, that he writes poem after poem after poem. And then he commits suicide because his ardor for her is so strong. And he asks, because we see a funeral going to happen with his corpse, his cadaver. We find out that he has asked his good friend to have the literature he has written burned. But an argument is made at his funeral that, well, he's already dead. Why destroy these last vestiges of him? He's too young to have children, he was unmarried. This is all that remains of him. And he made the request to destroy his work when he was out of his mind. So to grant the request of someone who is out of their mind, is that to do good or to do evil? There are two sort of major examples of this. Your friend is drunk and angry. They show up at your door and they demand the gun that they've lent to you. Do you give it to them? And if you do, did you do something good or bad? Say you'd say yes, and then they go to kill somebody. Are you partially at fault? The other example, this sort of very dark example, is say you exist in Germany during the time of the Holocaust and you are harboring a Jewish individual, and the authorities come to your door and say, are you harboring Jewish individuals here? You say yes or no. Obviously, lying to authority is in general bad, but in this case, you might be following a higher authority, as it were. And so sometimes to lie is more appropriate than telling the truth. In any case, a very learned example from mythology, actually this from real life, is used as Virgil, the writer of the Aeneid, one of the four great epics of Western civilization, the Roman epic. He requested at the end of his life that his Aeneid be destroyed. But Augustus Caesar, the new emperor, called Princeps at that time, where we get the word principle from, demanded the work which was written in order to solidify Rome and to create a piece of art in the Roman language he had it saved. So that's used as an example for why Grysóstomo's work. In his work, he calls, very similar to how Don Quixote speaks of Dulcinea, he says that Marcella is cruel, that she has in some way used her agency, she's actively denied him what he wants most in the world. Now, where this becomes modernist is not in a typical male figure projecting his lust onto a woman who obviously doesn't understand, but that the woman who is herself dressed as a man, like Rosalind from As You Like It, shows up and gets to speak for herself. And when she does speak for herself, she makes some pretty good points. She says, we understand that if somebody is beautiful, people love them. But just because you're beautiful, does that mean you need to love the people that love you? What if they're not beautiful? Is it her responsibility as the beloved to return the love to somebody if they do not have the same qualities that make her lovable? That is an excellent question, isn't it? Am I to blame for his grief? She denied him. She was not cruel to him. She said no. She didn't deceive him. She didn't promise him. She didn't accept him. Where is the lie? Where is the misdeed on her part? She runs off after saying her piece. And Don Quixote, of all things, accepts her speech, which is interesting because he's so often deluded and acts against reason in his own life. And yet, when he hears this philosophical reasoning of this woman herself having donned a new identity like him, it resonates with him. He thinks, yeah, even though this man was pretty upset by being denied the company of this woman, was it her responsibility to accept him? No, she has her own will, her own desires. And if she denied him outright, it's not the same as if she had accepted him and then chosen another over him and then married in secret, as we will see happen later on. In any case, Don Quixote then sets off to find Marcella, and this is the end of part 2 of the first volume of Don Quixote. All right. Yes, we get some more pain. The episode of the ponies, where poor Rocinante chases after some ponies. He's not locked up or rather bridled by Sancho, because Sancho is such an old, decrepit horse. There's no way he'll run away. And there's young female ponies, and he gets some get up back in him, and then he gets beaten mercilessly. Rocinante is very much a figure of Don Quixote, is very much a figure of Sancho. They're all fairly frequently beaten. Don Quixote again brings up, if only we had the Balm of Fierabras, things would be better. We will get this. So after being beaten to a pulp yet again, Don Quixote returns to the inn, which he defines as a castle, where the innkeeper is defined as a lord, and this his daughter Maritornes, who is herself a lady of the evening, is defined as a princess. Maritornes apparently has decided that one of these muleteers that's staying in the inn is a fairly handsome guy and has made an agreement to meet him after hours. They're going to do whatever it is people do in the dark with each other. And yet, unfortunately for her, she goes in through the wrong door and finds Don Quixote. Don Quixote thinks that this princess is overcome by lust for him. I want you to really sit with how funny that is. This is an old, ear missing, crazy, not perhaps the most eligible bachelor you can imagine. And so he thinks that this is a test for him to not give in to his own lust for this woman who really, really, really wants him. As it turns out, however, she is mistaken. He says some foolish Don Quixote has things, exotic things, to her, and the muleteer who has been waiting for her becomes jealous, who runs into the room and again beats Don Quixote into a pulp. A member of the Holy Brotherhood, which is something like the police force that roves around the countryside dealing with various bandits. It's in service of the king. Here's this, and all the various characters go their own ways. Balm of Fierabras, and this is where I'll conclude today. Don Quixote then makes the Balm of Fierabras. As we talked about earlier, do we think that this potion will in fact be magic? Well, it depends on what your definition of magic is. Does magic, is it magic to get food poisoning? When Don Quixote drinks this emetic, it makes him vomit, and then he feels good. When he feeds it to Sancho, Sancho starts to explode from, as described in the text, both ends, and after feeling extremely, extremely sick. And so yet again, we see an attempt by Don Quixote to redefine and create something from fiction and to put it in reality. And yet, when he does so, does it have the effect that he thinks it does? He thinks that he is healthy after vomiting. He's certainly not invincible. But Sancho himself thinks never, and says, never give that to me again. I'll take wine, definitely wine over water. In any case, that is what happens at this so-called castle, which is actually an inn with this lady of the evening who seemed like a princess, who seemed as if she were interested in Don Quixote and yet was very much not. All right, and that's all I have for today.